Alright, so after multiple leads with 0 amps, these two, we shorted them out in the meter and did a continuity check, and we had continuity between the two. When we hit that guy on the hot, we're getting our 120 at the meter. This guy here on the hot, we're getting 0, and we're picking up on this guy. So that's the bad cable.
Hey, what's up guys? You're watching Bobsdecline, where we cover pretty much anything and everything that has to do with line work and being a lineman. We had a crazy week this week. What else is new? But as I say in many conversations with the guys in the comments section, the great thing about being a lineman is even after 20, 21 years in the trade, you still learn something new every day. And we had this really weird call. It all started a few months back. There was a fire in 2 units of a multi-unit condo. This is an old setup. There was 14 condos with wires all direct buried, fed just willy-nilly into that pad mount transformer. The fire was so bad it completely melted the wires going into the customer's meter socket. So the wires shorted out together and drew a crazy amount of current underground through the lines where they're buried with multiple other units, and the heat was so intense it melted the jacket completely off the wires. So at the time we tested the wires going to the 2 burned units, which obviously failed. We cut them off at the pad mount transformer, re-energized the remaining customers, and put in a work order to do a little bit of maintenance in the area. Unfortunately, things didn't last very long. One of the customers next door, only a few weeks later, they started having some power flickers and then it went out. We tested the cables, theirs were bad as well. Thing is, we don't own the wires, they're customer owned. So the customer had to call an electrician, dig up the ground. We're not gonna have them run new wires direct buried in the ground like they did back in the day. They're gonna run some duct work over. We're gonna replace our pad mount transformer, add a URD box, a sub-grade box for the connectors, and try to get things up and running the best we can. All right guys, so we're gonna take a work permit while we do this work, as those high voltage cables are also direct buried. And you can see when we zoom in, once we take the permit, there's no place to install the ground on the stinger, on the cable underneath the cutout. So we've got these super handy little adapters that fit right into the bottom of the cutout. You can put them on with your hot stick, your grab ball. It just sits in the bottom jaws of the cutout. You tighten that up with a stick. These are made by ABB, as you can see. And it gives you a spot, a lug to install your ground. So just while we're getting the bucket set up, the rest of the crew is laying out some plywood for our corner mount to get in on the lawn and lift that pad mount transformer. We're going to be changing that to replacing it just for some preventative maintenance. So here, first step, we're opening our cutouts. Those are load break cutouts, so we don't need a load buster. And he's removing the door now. We're going to be removing the taps anyways, so he could remove the door either immediately after opening or once the taps are removed. That step doesn't really matter. Anytime you are working on a high voltage line though, you should at least remove the door or remove the tap, basically the riser, the wire going up to the high voltage. So he's just getting in place here to open the second cutout. These are polymer cutouts, so we don't have to worry about any cracking in the porcelain. Open that guy up a little bit slow, but with the load break cutouts, it's not as important to give them a quick yank when you open them up. So his next step is going to be to remove those riser leads to the primary. Especially when you're putting grounds on the bottom of the cutout or on the cable and in close proximity to the top jaws of that cutout, you definitely don't want to be doing that while those riser leads are still energized. In some circumstances, you won't have a choice if they're impacted on, in which case you just have to be extremely careful. But when they're removable, definitely take them off. So that piece he's hooked onto with the grab ball, that's what we call the tap clamp. Just spin her counterclockwise and flick that off. The attachment point that it's tapped onto is called a stirrup. We don't put it directly on the wire. because if that connection does start arcing at any point, it can hit and damage the wire. The connection where the stirrup goes on the wire is a much better connection. There's a much larger surface area that's just coated in penetrox, so it very rarely burns off. So we're removing both taps. I should also mention that we had communicated with our dispatch already and have permission to open these two cables and remove the leads. And some of you are probably wondering why there's two as opposed to three or one. Typically it's a single phase line or a three-phase line. This is not a two-phase line, it's actually two single phase runs. Again, it's an old standard that we simply would not build anymore. Basically it's two separate single phase lines, one feeding each pad mount. So he's just checking for potential, checking for voltage on the dead cables, testing his proximity indicator against the live one. That's why he went up against the overhead, just to make sure that it is working. And there is no potential. So the next step will be to install the grounds. Now, when we open a line like this, both of those cables, they go over to the pad mount. That's it. So it's a radial feed. Basically, there's no alternate feed once they're open, so we don't have to check any open points on the other end. In this case, however, where our work area does rely on two protection points, two open devices, we're not taking it as a radial permit, we're taking it as a permit with two protection points.
Hey Miguel, it's not a radial, so once you have the adapters in, just hang on before you ground it. Okay.
It's a bit of an oddball situation, and while I'm sure Miguel was aware not to install the grounds until we communicate back to our dispatch, it's definitely a great reminder, because it is an odd situation to have these radial feeds and not be allowed to ground until getting permission from our dispatch. So he's just popping those adapters in the bottom of the cutout now. It's important that you get those tight on that brass jaw at the bottom, and you can see where the lug's sticking out, giving a perfect grounding point for your ductile grounds. So he's just installing the second one now, getting to position. Ideally, you do want them to sit in the very belly of those jaws. They're designed a bit funny where that cutout is angled inwards towards the pole. You would have to have a stick pretty well come from the back side of the pole to sit all the way deep into that jaw. I did confirm with him that they were seated and good and tight. So just while we're waiting to hear back from our dispatcher to put those grounds on, I want to give a real special shout out to two brand new companies, small businesses, both started by Lineman in the trade. One is Lineman Coffee Company and the other is Livewire Caffeine Company, both of which design a brand of coffee that's specifically for Lineman. It's a really cool idea. I love the names of the products on the bags, as you can see here. I've been drinking nothing but Lineman coffee for the last couple weeks. What persuaded me to give these guys a shout out, because this is not sponsored at all, it's not a paid ad, I was really impressed by the fact that these guys are communicating with each other to help establish a customer base, as these cross-border transactions can get tricky with food products. So we have the Lineman Coffee Company, who are based out of Canada, and we have Livewire Caffeine Company based out of the USA. Check them out on Instagram, guys. Look them up, send them a message. Real great guys to have a chat with. I'll make sure to put some links down below in the description of the video. All right, so now we've got permission from our dispatch to install our grounds and go to work. So he's already checked for potential, and what you're about to see, he's going to put the ground on the neutral side here first by hand with his 20 kV gloves. We do have a multi-grounded system, and the neutral's wrapped around that triplex, so it's pretty tricky to get in there with a stick.
Don't forget that triplex is hot,
I do believe I mentioned to him here to not forget that triplex is energized, especially you can see he's kind of close to that crimpet cover. So you want to keep that in mind. This outage only affects those primary cables. That triplex is energized at 122.40 volts. So while he can put the neutral side on by hand with his 20 kV glove, he will have to use a stick, obviously, to ground out the cable. Those primary cables can in fact, will hold a capacitive charge. So oftentimes you'll see a quick little snap, a small little arc when you apply the ground. I've mentioned this a few times in videos. You want to apply the ground quickly and firmly. You don't want to tease the connection. So you can see he snaps it right on, holds it down tight, and gives that grab ball a spin clockwise to tighten that up on that lug. So that cable is now grounded, and he'll move on to the next one. Another thing that's important to mention here, if we were working on that pole, we would also have to put a cluster around the wooden pole and bond that to the neutral, which is then bonded to the grounds as well. Because if you're working off hooks, you're on the pole, which is grounded. You put your hand over on something that was energized at primary, which is not now grounded. There could be a difference in potential between your hand on the primary cable and your feet, which are on the pole. So we have a 2-watt copper ground, that's our bond, I should say, that's connecting from our grounds to the pole to minimize any difference in potential. So again, here we've got a little bit closer look where you can see that duckbill clamps right onto that lug, and give that a good little squeeze. In some cases you'll attach that tap clamp that's kind of dangling there to a ground as well to keep it from swinging around, but in this case the only live stuff's a couple of feet up in the air. So we're just taking a little bit closer look at the job here now. I would imagine you're all quite confused as to what we're actually doing here. So as I mentioned, we are changing the pad mount transformer, and right here this is all dead and grounded here now. But right now we're just checking the weight of the transformer to make sure that we can handle the weight with our boom truck. You always want to verify the weight of anything any load you're lifting. What we're doing here, we're going to relabel all these secondary cables, those old Insulink connections. We're going to cut those out, replace those. Some of those wires that are cut off, some old ones that burn off, we're going to cut those off flush with the ground. As I mentioned, all these underground feeds to each of these units are customer owned. So that's the box right there that we put in the ground. We're going to be making all future connections in that box. There's a lot more room. But basically, the customer hired an electrician who had already run all the ductwork under the ground. That's why the ground's all chewed up there. But in order to run that wire over into our box and make the final connection, the pipe's not yet connected into our pad mount for the main cable to the box. In order to dig near that, we have to have those cables de-energized. So while the electrician is going to be digging in our work area near the high voltage cables, we're going to be replacing that pad mount with a brand new one, and also sorting out all those secondary runs, kind of taping them together so that we know which two hots go to which house. The neutrals are going to be pretty tricky, but we'll relabel all those. We'll cut off the ones that aren't being used. The feed for that URD box, the one that's flush mount with the ground, there's going to be a 4-inch duct going from that to the pad mount, which is not yet in place. The electrician is going to be digging that. That's a temporary feed for the 2 units that are burned. We can't run any new wires over to the ones that burn in the fire, so that's going to be run off as temporary, and that's a tech cable, steel shielded cable that's going to run directly into our pad mount or maybe the URD box to get a temporary feed for the restoration crew. There's Johnny. We all saw Johnny in Kentucky there, for any of you that were watching the live videos while we were in Kentucky. So this truck's heavy. This is like 30,000 pound truck, and 3/4 inch plywood works really great at dispersing the weight on the ground so you don't damage the lawn. You can hear the plywood creaking and snapping as we go, but it's hardly making a dent in the grass. Once we clean up and leave, most times the grass is simply laid over and it stands back up within a few days. We were short one piece of plywood there, so we're going to grab one off the front and back him up as close as possible. We had originally planned for our little off-road machine, our little backlot machine, to do this lift, but it wouldn't start. The guys messed around with it at the office for half hour, an hour or something, couldn't get it to start. So we didn't want to waste any more time, so instead they loaded up the plywood, and we're going to be using our corner mount truck to load up that pad mount transformer, which, if I remember correctly, weighed right around 1,200 pounds. So when you're using a corner mount bigger truck, obviously its ideal lifting position is with the boom straight up in the air. With the amount of plywood that we have on hand, we pasted out and we figured we can make this lift with the boom right straight out horizontal, but we've got to get as close as possible. I think it's 11 paces from the back sheet of that plywood. Stop. So it's important also when doing this lift to check your load chart on the boom. Anytime you do a lift, you should reference that load chart, especially if you're using multiple different vehicles. Right here we're just having another tailboard. I think I cut the camera here in a second, but we had an initial tailboard when we arrived on site, and then we had a second tailboard once everything was set up. So that cable we just looked at, that's the piece that's 350 MCM aluminum, and that's the piece that's going to go from the pad mount into that URD box. It's quite a bit larger than all the service cables, as it's going to be attached to multiple cables. That's the new pad mount there. Those bolts that you can see sticking out on the side with those straps, those are the lifting lugs. You'll want to make sure you lift these guys by the lifting lugs. The casing, the steel casing, is designed to support the entire 1,200 pounds by those lugs. So I think the guys end up taking the lugs out of the new one, as someone had removed them from the old one, which is not a big deal. You can see here our boom, we're pretty well at 0 degrees, almost horizontal. So all booms have a little dial on the side like that. As you lift it, the dial will swing down to show your angle, and you want to reference that angle with the load chart, which I'm looking for and can't seem to find. It's usually mounted on your turret somewheres here. It's the winch capacity, and oh, there it is right there. Positive plus, we're at 0 degrees. So take a look at this chart. 0 degrees at full extension is good for 1,300 pounds, 590 kilograms. So we're close. Like I said, I think it was 1,100 pounds, maybe 1,200. There is a safety factor built into that as well. So the boys are pretty well all set up now. This, as most of you know, oh, there's a weight there, 1,195 pounds. So as most of you know, I am a troubleman. I don't typically get involved in jobs like this that take all day. However, I was on site during the fire, and I was coordinating with the customer and the contractor quite a bit on this one.
All right, so the boys are all squared away here now. This isn't my work permit. We got another guy going to be in charge of the job site. The reason I was here kind of getting things on the go in the morning is I responded to the trouble call initially when we had the fire. We isolated those two homes at the end. The cables, when we opened the pad mount, there was smoke coming right out of the pad mount. It melted the cables right into the pad mount. So we took an outage, we cleared those, got the remaining customers back on, and then fast forward 2 weeks later, another set of the low voltage cables failed, again from the extreme heat from when they were shorting together during the fire. They could be in the same trench. A lot of these cables are direct buried. Long ways from any standards for this stuff nowadays. This is an absolute mess. It was buried a long time ago. A lot of direct buried wires. So we're not going to start running ducts to each and every unit. That's all customer owned. That'll be up to the customer at some point if they want to run ducts to it. If that occurs in the future, now that we have that URD box buried, they'll be able to run a duct from the home to that new box, which has got room for six services for sure. So it'll make things a little easier moving forward. I'm gonna head out now that the boys are squared away, and we kind of had a real good tailboard. I showed them what the plan was that we come up with the supervisor and the foreman at the office in preparation for this day. So I gotta head off, start doing my regular work for the day. We'll stop in later on today, see how the boys are making out, make sure everything went smooth. So I just popped back at the end of the day to check in on, see how things went. The boys were checking voltage at each and every meter socket, and the fellow was just going through, putting all the meters back on. They've got the lawn, I don't want to say fixed, but
Everything's covered back up. They ran the ducts over to the new pad mount. She's pretty well all set to go. Everyone's got their power back. We've got 3 new runs of secondary. The contractor actually ran the duct work from the URD box over to within like 10 feet of those 2 units that were burnt. So once those units are fully restored, they only have to dig within 10 feet of the unit. They won't really have to involve us at all until they're ready to pull the wire through and have it hooked up. So it was a pretty long day. The boys did really well. They had the job from start to finish done in like 5 or 6 hours, which is really good. Had a good crew of guys there, but it's super late. I gotta get to bed. So thanks for stopping in as always, guys, and we'll see y'all soon.